A mother walks into her nursery one morning in 1906 and finds a portrait of her 6-month-old daughter hanging on the wall. Nothing unusual about that, except the baby in the painting now looks 70 years old. Wrinkled skin, hollow eyes, a face that has lived an entire lifetime while the real child slept peacefully in her crib. The artist swears he painted a baby. The mother knows what she saw. And somewhere between those two truths lies something that shouldn't exist. This is the story of the Hartwell portrait, a painting that defied every law of nature, a mystery that consumed an entire town, and a warning that some images should never be captured on canvas. Rochester, New York in 1906 was a city of progress. Kodak cameras were being mass-produced. Electric streetlights replaced gas lamps. People believed science could explain everything. Margaret Hartwell believed that too. She was a rational woman, a school teacher. She didn't believe in superstitions or ghost stories, which made what happened to her even more impossible to dismiss. Margaret and her husband Thomas lived in a modest Victorian home on Alexander Street. They had one child, a daughter named Eleanor, 6 months old, perfect in every way that matters to a parent. Bright blue eyes, soft blonde curls, a smile that could light up a room. Margaret wanted to preserve that moment forever, so she hired a portrait artist. His name was William Crowley. He came recommended by 3 different families in Rochester. His portraits hung in parlors across the city, realistic, detailed. Some said his paintings looked more alive than photographs. That should have been the first warning. Crowley arrived at the Hartwell home on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He set up his easel in the nursery where the light was best. Eleanor sat in her mother's lap. She was a good baby, didn't fuss much. Crowley worked quickly. His brush moved across the canvas with confidence. He barely looked up, just painted. Margaret watched him work for 2 hours before Eleanor needed to sleep. Crowley said he had enough. He would finish the rest from memory and sketches. He returned 3 days later with the completed portrait. Margaret gasped when she saw it. The painting captured Eleanor perfectly. Every detail, the exact shade of her eyes, the way her fingers curled, the slight dimple in her left cheek. It was like looking at her daughter frozen in time. Thomas agreed. They paid Crowley his fee, $20, a significant amount in 1906. They hung the portrait in the nursery that evening, above the crib, where Margaret could see it every time she entered the room. That night, Eleanor wouldn't stop crying. She wasn't sick, no fever, no signs of teething, just inconsolable screaming. Margaret walked her around the house for hours. Nothing worked. Finally, around 3 in the morning, Eleanor fell asleep. But she kept whimpering, like she was having a nightmare. Margaret had never heard her daughter make sounds like that. The next morning changed everything. Margaret entered the nursery to feed Eleanor. The morning light came through the window. She glanced at the portrait out of habit. Then she stopped. Her hand went to her mouth. The baby in the painting looked different. The face was thinner, the cheeks less round. The eyes seemed darker, tired somehow. Margaret told herself she was exhausted, that she was seeing things because she'd barely slept. But deep down, she knew what she was looking at. The portrait had changed. She didn't tell Thomas, not yet. She needed to be sure, so she studied the painting throughout the day. By noon, she was certain. The baby in the portrait was aging, not dramatically, but noticeably. The soft baby fat in the cheeks was disappearing. The skin looked different, less perfect, more lived in. By evening, the portrait showed a child who looked at least 2 years old. Eleanor was still 6 months old. Still the same perfect baby. But her painted image was growing up without her. Margaret told Thomas that night. He thought she was losing her mind. Lack of sleep, post-birth anxiety. He looked at the portrait and saw nothing wrong, just the same baby he'd seen when they first hung it. Margaret insisted. She grabbed his arm, made him really look, and then he saw it too. The change was subtle, but it was there. The painting no longer matched their daughter. It showed an older child. Thomas touched the canvas. The paint was completely dry. This wasn't a trick of wet paint shifting. This was something else. They decided to take the portrait down. Thomas reached for it, but Margaret stopped him. Something in her gut said not to touch it. Not yet. They needed to understand what was happening first. They needed answers, so they did what rational people do. They contacted the artist. William Crowley arrived the next afternoon. He looked at the portrait for a long time. His face went pale. He touched the canvas, examined it from different angles. Then he sat down heavily in the nursery chair. He told them something he'd never shared with any client before. Every portrait he painted had a quirk, a flaw, something slightly off. He did it on purpose, a signature of sorts, a way to prove the painting was his work. But this portrait had no flaw. It was perfect, too perfect. He'd tried to add his usual imperfection, but his hand wouldn't cooperate. The painting had painted itself through him. Margaret asked what that meant. Crowley didn't have an answer. He just knew that something had happened during the creation, something beyond his control. He offered to take the painting back, destroy it. But Thomas refused. They'd paid good money. And besides, maybe they were all overreacting. Maybe the painting just looked different in various lights. Crowley left. But before he did, he gave them one warning. Don't let the baby see the portrait. Don't let her look at her own painted face. They ignored that warning. How do you keep a 6-month-old from seeing a painting that hangs in her own room? Eleanor saw the portrait every day, and every day, the portrait aged. By the end of the first week, the painted child looked 5 years old. By the end of the second week, 10. The changes came faster now, more dramatic. The painted Eleanor developed features the real Eleanor didn't have yet. A longer nose, different shaped eyes, the face of a stranger wearing Eleanor's name. Margaret stopped sleeping. She sat in the nursery at night, watching the portrait, trying to catch the moment it changed, but she never did. The aging happened when she blinked, when she looked away, like the painting knew it was being watched and waited for her attention to slip. Thomas wanted to burn it. Margaret still said no. Some part of her thought if they destroyed the portrait, something would happen to Eleanor, that the painting and the baby were connected somehow, that one couldn't exist without the other. Other people started noticing. The nanny came to work and screamed when she saw the portrait. She quit on the spot, wouldn't even collect her final wages, just ran from the house and never came back. Thomas's brother visited and asked why they had a painting of a teenage girl in the nursery. Margaret's mother refused to enter the room, said it felt wrong, like something was watching her from inside the canvas. The portrait reached adolescence by the 3rd week. The painted Eleanor looked 15, then 20, then 30. The real Eleanor was still 6 months old, still learning to sit up on her own, still the same innocent baby. But her painted self was living an entire life on canvas, and the expression on the painted face was changing too. The early paintings had shown a happy child. This face looked haunted, exhausted, like it carried the weight of all those compressed years. Margaret noticed something else. Eleanor wasn't developing normally. She should have been reaching milestones, trying to crawl, babbling more, but she seemed stuck. Frozen at 6 months old, like all her growth was being stolen by the painting, fed into the canvas. Margaret finally agreed. The portrait had to go. They tried to take it down on a Sunday morning. Thomas climbed on a chair and reached for the frame. The moment his fingers touched it, he jerked back. The canvas was hot, not warm, hot enough to burn. He showed Margaret his fingertips. Blisters were already forming. They got gloves. Heavy work gloves. Thomas tried again. This time he managed to lift the portrait off its hook. The wall behind it was covered in black mold. Spreading out from where the painting had hung, the mold moved, crawled across the wallpaper like it was alive. Margaret grabbed Eleanor and ran from the room. Thomas dropped the portrait. It landed face up on the nursery floor, and that's when they both saw it clearly for the first time in full light, away from the wall. The painted Eleanor was now an old woman, 70 years old at least. Deep wrinkles, gray hair, hollow cheeks, and her eyes. Her painted eyes were looking directly at them, following them. The eyes in the portrait moved. They called for help. The police came first. They thought it was a domestic dispute. Then they saw the portrait, saw the mold, saw the way the painted eyes tracked movement. They called for a priest. Father Donnelly from St. Mary's Church arrived within the hour. He was an old man. He'd seen things in his decades of service. But even he hesitated when he entered that nursery. He blessed the portrait, said prayers over it. The painted woman's mouth opened. Not much, just slightly, like she was trying to speak or scream. Father Donnelly told them the portrait needed to be destroyed, not burned. Fire might release whatever was trapped inside. It needed to be buried, deep, in consecrated ground, with specific rituals. He knew a place, an old cemetery outside Rochester, closed to new burials for 20 years. But there was a section reserved for objects, things that couldn't be destroyed but couldn't be kept. He'd used it twice before, once for a mirror, once for a music box. Both had done things they shouldn't. They wrapped the portrait in blessed cloth. Father Donnelly wouldn't let them use a car, said the painting couldn't be in an enclosed space with people, so they rented a horse-drawn cart, like something from the previous century. They transported the portrait on a cold April evening. The roads were empty. The sky was overcast. Margaret stayed home with Eleanor. Thomas and Father Donnelly made the journey, 5 miles outside the city, to a cemetery so old most of the headstones were unreadable. Thomas would later describe what happened next in letters he wrote but never sent. They dug a hole 6 feet deep in the reserved section, far from any actual graves. Father Donnelly performed a ritual Thomas didn't understand, Latin words, symbols drawn in the dirt. Then they lowered the portrait into the ground, still wrapped in cloth. As it descended, Thomas swore he heard something. A voice, old and cracked, coming from the canvas. It said one word, finally. They buried the portrait, filled the hole, marked it with nothing. Father Donnelly said it was better that way. No marker meant no one would dig there. No curious person would unearth it. They returned to Rochester in silence. Thomas paid Father Donnelly. The priest refused at first, then took the money and donated it to the church. He told Thomas to never commission another portrait of his daughter, to never allow her image to be captured by brush or paint. Photographs were safer, less intimate, less likely to trap something. Eleanor began developing normally the next day, like a switch had been flipped. She rolled over on her own, started babbling, reached for toys, all the things she should have been doing weeks ago. The mold on the nursery wall disappeared, just vanished overnight. The room felt lighter, warmer. Margaret could breathe again without feeling like something was watching her. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after what they'd experienced. But that's not where the story ends. Stories like this never really end. They just wait. 3 months later, a man came to the Hartwell home. He introduced himself as Daniel Crowley, William's younger brother. He said William had died 2 weeks after painting Eleanor's portrait. Sudden illness, fever that came from nowhere. He was dead within 3 days. The family was handling his estate, going through his studio, and they found something. A journal. William had kept detailed notes on every painting he ever created. The Hartwell portrait had its own section, pages of entries. Daniel brought the journal with him. He thought they should see it. Margaret and Thomas read the entries. William had known something was wrong from the moment he started painting. He wrote that his hand moved without his control, that the portrait was painting itself through him. He tried to stop, tried to put down the brush, but he couldn't. Some force compelled him to finish, and when he completed the painting, he knew he'd created something dangerous, something that would take from the subject. The portrait wasn't meant to age. It was meant to steal Eleanor's life, to consume her years and add them to itself. William had tried to warn them. That's why he told them not to let Eleanor see it. But he knew they wouldn't listen. People never do. The journal had one final entry. Written the day before William died. He wrote that he was starting to age rapidly, that his body was paying the price for what he'd created, that every portrait takes something from the artist, too. But this one took everything. He was 52 years old when he painted Eleanor. He looked 90 when he died. The death certificate listed natural causes, old age. But the doctor who examined him was confused. His organs were elderly, worn out, like they belonged to someone decades older. Daniel asked if the portrait still existed. Thomas lied, said they'd destroyed it, burned it right after Crowley's visit. Daniel looked relieved. He said good. He said his brother's journal contained instructions, a way to break the connection between subject and painting. But it required the portrait to be destroyed in a specific way. Fire wouldn't work. Water wouldn't work. It needed to be buried in blessed ground, 6 feet deep, during a new moon. And whoever buried it needed to mark the spot with salt. Thomas went pale. They'd done exactly that, without reading any instructions, like something had guided them. The Hartwells never spoke about the portrait again. Eleanor grew up healthy, normal. She never remembered any of it. Too young. But Margaret noticed something as Eleanor got older. Her daughter aged differently than other children. Slower, somehow. She looked younger than her peers. At 10, she could pass for 7. At 20, she looked 15. Margaret wondered if the portrait had taken some of her years, but then given them back. If Eleanor would live longer than normal. If that was a blessing or a curse. Eleanor Hartwell lived to be 103 years old. She died in 2009. Sharp mind until the end. Clear skin, bright eyes. Her obituary called her remarkably well-preserved. People asked her secret. She always said clean living and good genes. She never knew about the portrait. Her parents made sure of that. They told her the painting was lost in a house fire, that all they had were photographs. And Eleanor was fine with that. She never liked having her picture taken anyway. Said it felt like something was being stolen from her. The cemetery outside Rochester was sold to developers in 1987. The land was cleared for a shopping plaza, but construction stopped after the first week. Workers refused to continue. They said the ground in one section wouldn't settle, that every time they tried to dig, they hit something solid, something that shouldn't be there. Geologists surveyed the area, found nothing unusual, just dense soil. But the workers knew better. They said the ground felt wrong, like it was keeping something down, like it was protecting people from what lay beneath. The developers abandoned that section, built around it. There's a small landscaped area in the middle of the parking lot now, trees and grass, a bench. People eat lunch there. They have no idea what's buried 15 feet below them. The portrait of Eleanor Hartwell, still wrapped in blessed cloth, still lying in its grave, still aging. Because that's the thing about curses. They don't end when you bury them. They just wait. They sleep. And sometimes, late at night, security guards at the plaza report seeing something strange. A flash of light from the landscaped area, like someone taking a photograph. But there's never anyone there. Just empty grass and dark trees. And if you look closely at the ground, you might notice the grass doesn't grow quite right in one spot. A circular patch, about the size of a portrait frame. The soil there is always slightly darker, always slightly cold, even in summer. William Crowley's journal was donated to the Rochester Historical Society in 1995. They archived it with his other papers. Art students occasionally request to see it, to study his techniques, his methods, but they're never allowed to read the section about the Hartwell portrait. Those pages have been sealed, archived separately, with a note that says they can only be opened with permission from the curator and a licensed historian. No one has ever requested access, and the curator prefers it that way. There are other portraits out there, other paintings by William Crowley, hanging in homes across Rochester, in museums, in private collections. Most of them are fine, normal paintings, beautiful but ordinary. But 3 families have reported strange occurrences, subjects who aged faster than they should, Subjects who stopped aging entirely. A portrait of a man who seemed to move when no one was looking. The Rochester Historical Society tracks these reports, keeps files, just in case. They have a protocol. If another portrait shows signs of activity, they know what to do. They have Father Donnelly's notes, his ritual instructions, the location of the old cemetery, or what's left of it. But here's what keeps historians up at night. William Crowley painted over 300 portraits in his career. Most have been documented, located, accounted for, but 67 are missing, lost to time, sold to unknown buyers, hanging in attics or storage units, waiting to be discovered, and no one knows if those paintings are safe, if they're normal, or if they're like the Hartwell portrait, alive in ways they shouldn't be, taking from their subjects, aging on their own, watching through painted eyes. So if you ever come across a portrait, if you find one in an estate sale or an antique shop, if it's signed by William Crowley, if it's dated between 1895 and 1906, look closely at the subject's eyes. See if they follow you. See if the person looks different than they should, and if you feel that cold touch of recognition, that sense that something is wrong. Walk away. Don't buy it. Don't take it home. Some art isn't meant to be owned. Some images are better left forgotten, because every portrait captures something. A moment, a likeness, a piece of the soul. And sometimes, in the hands of the wrong artist, it captures much more than that. Margaret Hartwell died in 1954. She was 71 years old, but people at her funeral said she looked older, much older, like she'd lived multiple lifetimes, like she'd carried a weight no one else could see. Her last words were to Thomas. She asked if he thought Eleanor was safe, if they'd done enough, if the portrait was truly gone. Thomas said yes. He lied, because the truth is, he didn't know. No one knows. The portrait is still down there, under concrete and grass, under the feet of people shopping for groceries, and every year it ages, even in the dark, even in the ground. It continues the life that was started in 1906. The life it stole from a baby named Eleanor. And here's the final detail that no one talks about. The detail that was buried with William Crowley's journal. The sealed pages mention one more thing. The portrait didn't just age, it predicted. Every wrinkle that appeared on the painted face eventually appeared on Eleanor. Every mark, every sign of aging. But it appeared on the portrait first, sometimes years in advance. Like the painting was showing Eleanor her future, mapping out the life she would live. And that means somewhere, buried in the ground, there's a portrait of a 103-year-old woman. A painting that finally caught up to its subject. A painting that has nowhere left to go, unless it starts over, unless it resets, unless it finds a new subject to feed from. And that's why the Historical Society keeps watch. That's why they track the missing portraits. Because they know what William Crowley knew, what he wrote on the last page of his journal, the page that was sealed, the page that only 3 people have ever read. It says this: the portraits never die. They only sleep, and when they wake, they hunger. The plaza closes at midnight. The lights go out. The parking lot empties. And if you were there, standing on that spot of grass, you might hear something. A sound like canvas stretching, like paint cracking, like something trying to push through the ground. You might see the grass move, just slightly, like something beneath is breathing. And you might wonder what would happen if someone dug there, if someone found the portrait, if someone unwrapped the blessed cloth and looked at the face. Would it still show Eleanor? Or would it show something else? Something that has aged beyond human years, beyond human life. Something that has become more than a painting, more than a curse. The answer is buried 6 feet down, waiting in the dark.